Hey there, viewers. Disturbing new information has just come to light from inside Oprah's school. A doctor has officially confirmed that multiple children may have contracted HIV while under the school's care. The details are heartbreaking, and the questions surrounding how this happened are only growing louder. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The letters they never meant to send. It came in a brown envelope. One of those thin paper ones with a metal clasp and a gum-sealed flap that crinkles when you open it too fast. No return address, no postage, just there, sitting in my hallway like it had walked itself inside while I was out getting milk. I live alone now, in a quiet flat just off Lower Main Road in Cape Town. 2 rooms, 1 squeaky floorboard, and a back window that stares into a brick wall. I don't get letters, haven't for years. Everything's email now. PDFs, statements, fake coupons from Woolies. But this envelope looked like it knew me. Like it had waited. All right. At first, I thought it might have been from the clinic, maybe something left over from my old days volunteering, a patient follow-up, a data breach. But when I picked it up, the paper felt weird, heavy, damp. Almost, like someone had touched it too long. The seal wasn't licked. It was pressed closed with a brown stain that smelled faintly like iodine. I should have thrown it away. God knows I wanted to. But my fingers worked faster than my sense of caution. I opened it. Slowly. Inside was a single page. Torn, not cut. It still had the jagged spine edge from whatever notebook it came from. You could see where the spiral binding had yanked some of the paper. The whole sheet was covered in scribbles, not just messy handwriting, but panicked lines, smudged ink, water stains. There were drawings, childish ones, like a little girl's, beds lined up in rows, stick figures with round heads and no mouths. Big red circles where their chests should be. One had her arms raised above her head, another had something dripping down her leg, red again, but uneven, like it had been rubbed with a thumb. The caption at the top read, "Empowered Protocol, marked girls only." I stared at it for a long time. My eyes went dry, and I didn't blink. My body forgot how to breathe properly, because I knew what it was. Not just the style of the notebook. Cheap counseling workbooks handed out during guided therapy sessions, but the phrasing, marked girls. That wasn't a phrase you forget, not when you've been around the people who said it like it was gospel. I hadn't thought about that place in years, not since I left quietly before the semester ended, not since I packed my bag one morning, ignored the calls from the wellness coordinator, and took the earliest flight I could find out of Johannesburg. I hadn't told anyone, not even my mother, what happened there. But I remembered the way the walls of Oprah's Leadership Academy were so white they hurt your eyes if the sun hit them just right. I remembered the way eucalyptus clung to everything, hallways, uniforms, even the food. They said it was sanitary branding. I called it suffocating. The entire school looked like a health spa designed by someone who'd never been sick a day in their life. And the silence, my God, the silence. It wasn't a peaceful kind. It was rehearsed. Every corner, every doorway, every conversation carried this pause. Like people were making sure they weren't saying the wrong thing, like even the floor tiles were listening. We weren't allowed to wear shoes in certain wings, something about dust control, and walking barefoot past the administrative offices always made me feel like I was sinking into some kind of invisible pit. I was just an intern, medical assistant technically, though they dressed it up with a title, wellness operations intern. I thought I'd be learning diagnostics, observing exams, maybe helping track vaccine records or organize health events. What I got was a clipboard, a color-coded badge, and strict instructions not to write down anything unless told to. You don't ask the girls how they feel, Nurse Riva told me the first day. You ask them how they're growing. We don't center illness here. She said it with a warm smile. Her teeth were perfectly straight, unnaturally white. She always wore light pink scrubs and a scarf tied like a crown. And she smelled like antiseptic and baby powder. I did as I was told. I stayed quiet, followed her from classroom to courtyard, from private wellness sessions to morning affirmations, and I took notes, but only the ones I was allowed. Growth charts, vision test logs, immunization stats. Nothing complicated. How could this talk at any point simulate danger? But Zenli complicated everything. She was 11, maybe 12, tall for her age, with skin so smooth it looked painted on. She had this strange habit of keeping her arms folded tightly across her stomach, like she was holding something inside. She didn't talk much, not unless prompted, but when she did, her voice was flat, soft, no inflection, like she was reading from a script that bored her. I first met her during a group workshop labeled Bodily Literacy and Empowered Identity. The session was led by a counselor from the States, someone flown in specifically to teach the girls how to rewrite the story of their body through affirming language. There were mirrors set up in a semicircle, and each girl had to stand and say something they released. Most said things like fear, self-doubt, or sadness. When it was Zinle's turn, she just stared at the mirror. Then she turned and looked straight at me, ignoring the counselor completely, and asked in that quiet, flat voice, "If I don't bleed, am I still counted?" Everyone froze. The counselor blinked like she didn't understand. One of the other girls giggled nervously, but I knew what she meant. She wasn't talking about periods or injury. She meant blood work. She meant the kind of bleeding you can't see. Later that day, I tried to bring it up with Riva. I told her about the question, about the way Zinle looked at me. Riva didn't even stop flipping through her folder. She just said, "Some girls process differently. It's important to focus on empowerment language. Pathology isn't the lens here." That was always the answer. Don't use pathology, don't label, don't define, don't diagnose. But the girls were being diagnosed. I know they were. We were running tests, quietly, under code names. I saw the samples. I saw the rapid test strips with the faint lines. I saw the labels marked Empowerment Index High Risk. I saw Zinle's file once, by accident, and it had a single red sticker on the top corner. No explanation, just the color red. One night, I found her sitting alone on the back steps outside the dining hall. Her arms were folded again, but this time she was rocking slightly, not crying, just moving, like a pendulum. I sat next to her. I didn't say anything for a while. Eventually, she whispered. I heard the others leave. They said it was for treatment, but they don't come back. I wanted to tell her that wasn't true, that she was safe, that she was just imagining things. But I couldn't lie to her. Not after what I'd seen, not after the locked rooms labeled reframing or the back gates that only opened at night. I never saw Zinle again after that week. They told me she transferred to a boarding program in the Eastern Cape. I asked to see the paperwork. Riva smiled. Transfers don't need your oversight, dear. You're not a decision maker here. And now, years later, her drawing was in my hands. I hadn't even realized I was crying until one of the drops splashed against the paper. I blinked, hard, trying to focus again. My thumb brushed against the bottom corner of the page. There was writing, barely visible, almost invisible under the smudges and ink. It was in pencil, child's handwriting, uneven. You confirmed me, I remember you. I dropped the paper. My stomach twisted. My hands started shaking. I wanted to believe it was a prank, A hoax, something made by someone with too much time on their hands. But I knew better. Hadn't said her name in 10 years. Hadn't told a soul what I saw. But somehow, she remembered me. And someone knew exactly where to send the proof. Chapter 2. Broadcast isn't what you think it means. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch, the drawing still on the kitchen table, as if it were watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw red circles, stick figures with no mouths. I heard Zinla's voice again, quiet, too mature for her age, asking if she still counted. Asking with no hope, just resignation. By morning, I'd made 3 cups of tea I didn't drink. I tried to distract myself with work, with laundry, even took a walk to the store for no reason at all. But it didn't matter. The memory had opened something, an old door I'd sealed off, boarded up, and forgotten. I didn't want to go back, but I already had. Late that afternoon, another envelope appeared. No knock, no footsteps, just there, resting against the door frame like it had grown from the wood. This one was thinner, no stain. I held it for a long time before opening it, expecting another page from some workbook, another drawing. But it wasn't that. An aching hope in the depths of my... It was a student ID card, one of the plastic ones they gave the girls to access their assigned dorms and common areas. Pale purple background, name printed in white. Her face was younger in the photo than I remembered. Zinle. Big eyes, neutral expression. Her braids tied back tight, too tight. The corner of the card had been cracked and taped back together with a single strip of red electrical tape. Behind it, tucked in the same envelope, was a strip of paper, typewritten. No logo, no signature. You were in the room, you let her walk through the second door. I sat down hard. The room. The second door. I hadn't thought about broadcast in years, not the way we called it back then. Not what it really was. It sounded innocent at first, like a media room, some alumni project, a place for filming testimonials or learning presentation skills. That's what it said in the training packet. Broadcast, empowerment through personal narrative and self-image development. But that's not what it was. Broadcast was a room in the west wing of the campus, tucked behind a double set of frosted glass doors that required a special key card to access. I only went there because Riva brought me once. She said it would be a learning opportunity. I remember the lighting more than anything. The entire space was lit with soft amber ceiling panels, no windows. The floor was polished black concrete, cold even through my socks. The walls were lined with full-length mirrors that weren't quite reflective. They made everyone look thinner, blurred, like your outline had been redrawn. There was one chair in the middle of the room, and a circle drawn around it with pale yellow tape. Riva called it the witness radius. I didn't understand the setup until the girls started coming in. One by one. They weren't given gowns or examination instructions. They weren't hooked up to anything. No stethoscopes, no blood pressure cuffs. Just a clipboard in Riva's hand and a second woman, Miss Temba, the school counselor, standing off to the side, always silent, always watching. The girl would sit in the chair. Riva would ask a single question. How does your body feel as a message today? Not how do you feel, not what symptoms are you experiencing, just that. A phrase designed to blur, to bend. Some girls answered in metaphors, heavy like rain, like there's a stone under my ribs. Others said nothing, just stared ahead or looked at their feet. If the answer was too vague or too specific, they were told to step outside through the side door. That second door wasn't the one they entered through. It was off to the left. No sign, no handle from the inside. Once they passed through it, you couldn't see where it led. I remember watching 5 girls go through it that week. None came back into the main hallway after their sessions. I asked Riva once where the second door led. She said, without looking up, "They're being reframed, that's our responsibility." I didn't understand what reframed meant, not then. I thought maybe it was just a euphemism for counseling, or maybe they were being sent home, transferred to another program. But the files didn't show transfers. Their attendance logs were blank after that day. Their dorms reassigned, sometimes overnight. When I asked again, Riva smiled and said, "We don't give them diagnoses, we give them affirmations." She said it like a slogan, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. I started noticing things after that. Not huge things, small irregularities. Thermometers that never worked, lesions that were described as spiritual bruises, fainting episodes that were blamed on narrative dissociation. One girl, Nomfundo, had a rash along her arms that looked like Kaposi sarcoma. I wasn't a doctor, but I'd studied enough HIV casework in my university rounds to recognize a warning sign. I tried to flag it in her chart. Riva tore the page out before it could be logged. "Notes like that," she said, "get filed under empowerment deviations." It was another phrase they loved to use, empowerment deviations, as if bleeding from the gums or collapsing during a dance session was just a spiritual misstep, as if the girls' bodies were betraying a message too fragile to hold truth. I stopped asking questions after that. I had to. The last intern who'd pushed too hard was dismissed without explanation. We were told she violated confidentiality agreements, but I heard from one of the cleaning staff that her badge was shredded and her emails erased. She disappeared so thoroughly that even Riva pretended not to know her name. I started avoiding broadcasts. I'd trade shifts, volunteer for food distribution, supply runs, anything to stay away from that amber-lit room and its awful circle. But I still saw it sometimes, in my dreams, in the shape of tea stains on the floor, in the way some girls folded their arms, mirroring each other like it was part of a choreography they were too scared to admit existed. And now, all these years later, someone was dragging it back to the surface. You were in the room. You let her walk through the second door. The words kept bouncing around my head like flies. I'd been there. I remembered Zinla's face in that room, remembered how still she sat, how she said nothing, not even a metaphor, and how she walked through the second door without looking back. It didn't stop her. I didn't ask where she was going. I just watched, because I thought I wasn't allowed to speak. Think. Maybe that's the part I can't forgive. Not the silence from them, but the silence from me. I turned the student ID card over in my hand. The tape was fraying, the barcode was smudged but still readable. She looked older in the photo now, even though it was taken before everything, like she already knew what was coming. I couldn't throw it away, couldn't even put it down. That night, I sat with it in my palm until the room went dark, until I couldn't tell whether my eyes were closed or the power had gone out. And when I finally stood up to go to bed, I saw something else. Another envelope. Not on the floor, not by the door, but tucked between the pages of my old anatomy textbook, which I hadn't opened in years. No return address, no markings. Just one word on the flap, written in that same thin pencil. Remember, Chapter 3, the infection was in the ritual. I don't remember keeping the journals, but there they were, buried in the back of my bedroom closet inside an old plastic tote with cracked edges and one broken handle. They smelled faintly of mildew and dust, like they'd soaked up years of forgetting. I'd labeled the outside in black marker, unsorted, do not open. That warning must have been for me. I carried them to the kitchen table. 4 small notebooks, spiral bound. one with bent pages from a leak that must have happened before I even moved here. They were supposed to be my records from the internship. Notes, reflections, case studies. Something to help me pad my resume, make it sound like I was more involved than I actually had been. But when I flipped them open, I felt this cold sort of static rise in my chest. Most of the pages were blank. Not scribbled over, not blacked out. Just blank. Page after page of silence in lined paper. I couldn't remember if I'd never written them or if someone had torn the truth out of them when I wasn't looking. Some pages had fragments, half-sentences, a list of temperatures with no names, the words "under threshold" repeated 3 times, and a margin note that read, "Speak only if it's empowering." Then I found the list. It was on the last page of the red notebook. Thin blue ink, slanted handwriting that didn't feel like mine but was somehow familiar. The names were listed vertically, followed by strange notations. Zinle, 1/1. Nation, Tondo 3/7. Quasi undetectable. There were no explanations, no dates, no symptoms, no test results, just names and strange numerical pairings. At first I thought maybe it was dosage logs or treatment ratios, but then I remembered the colors. Not medical colors, not red for blood or blue for veins. Robe colors. There had been robes. Not all the girls got them, just the ones who were selected for a program called the Symbolic Pathway. It wasn't on any brochure, not in the training packet. Riva never talked about it directly. It was whispered between staff and older girls. You'd only hear it if you were standing in the hallway at just the right time, or picking up dropped folders in the storage closet behind the counseling wing. The Symbolic Pathway was supposed to be a creative wellness initiative, something to help girls transform internal struggle into external leadership. It sounded harmless, even good, on paper, but it was a ritual. They didn't call it that, of course. They called it empowerment through embodied narrative. But once you saw it, once you were in the room during one of the sessions, you knew. Each girl was assigned a role, not based on who they were, but based on what the system wanted them to carry. There were 3 roles. The bleeder, she was always chosen first. She had to speak her guilt, real or imagined. Illness was framed as an emotional legacy, something she'd inherited by not processing trauma. She wore a red robe, spoke in group sessions while others chanted support lines. To the mirror, she never spoke. Her job was to smile, always. No matter what was happening around her, she maintained reflective silence. She wore white. Her silence was meant to hold space for transformation. That's what the facilitators said. The reclaimer, this girl retold other people's stories as her own, rehearsed testimonials, recovery narratives stitched together from different students. She wore gold. Her task was to carry composite memory. She was praised the most, often shown to donors. The robes weren't costumes, they were tools, worn during meditation, counseling, sometimes even during meals. Each time a girl was reassigned or left campus, her robe would be passed on. No washing, no cleansing, no reset. They said it was to preserve the lineage of strength. But what strength asks you to carry someone else's sickness? I remember seeing the robes hung on hooks behind the art studio. No lockers, no tags, just hanging there in plain view like trophies. Once, I saw Luwazi try to refuse hers, said it was too tight, said it smelled like metal. The facilitator just smiled and told her to breathe deeper. Into the shape of your narrative. She wore it anyway. And Zinla was never given a robe, at least not while I was there, but I saw her watching the others, her eyes following them as they entered the reframing hall, as they marched into group circle with solemn little steps. She wasn't jealous. She looked like someone waiting for a sentence to be carried out. Eyes flipped through the rest of the red notebook, but the ink started to bleed across the pages. Maybe from time, maybe from something else. One margin had a crude drawing, 3 robed figures standing in a triangle. Beneath it, in different handwriting. Only one was sick, but all 3 had to hold it. I felt dizzy, like the floor had tilted under me. I stood, needing air, but froze when I got to the front window. There was someone standing outside. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, or a delivery driver trying to figure out the unit numbers. But she wasn't holding anything, wasn't moving, just standing, right at the edge of the sidewalk, looking straight at my door. She was thin, older than I remembered her, mid-20s maybe. Her head was shaved. She wore a long gray sweater, frayed at the cuffs, and her hands were twitching, just slightly, like nerves misfiring. One eye was red, the other looked glassy, but the mouth? That's what hit me. She didn't speak, but her lips moved. 4 words. Slow, deliberate. I still have the robe. My hands went cold. I backed away from the window. When I looked again, she was gone. No footsteps, no knock, just a void where she'd been. I don't know how she found me. I don't know if she was real or if she came out of the notebook. I don't know which of them she was, but I know what she meant. The robes weren't for healing, they were for holding. And if she still had it, that meant the ritual never ended. Not for them, not for me, not for any of us. Chapter 4, Studio F, doesn't exist. The invitation came in the form of an email, glossy and impersonal. Subject line: Empowered Pathways, Integrative Mental Health and Education Conference, Johannesburg, Satellite Session. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but the body of the message mentioned something I hadn't heard in over a decade. Hosted on the historic grounds of the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls. I stared at it for a long time. The name pulled something tight in my chest. Part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend it was a coincidence. Another part knew, deep in my gut, that nothing about this was accidental. The event was open to alumni, former staff, mental health practitioners. I qualified under all 3, technically. I clicked register, filled out the form with a fake surname and a burner email address. I didn't need anyone recognizing me. Not yet. 2 weeks later, I was standing at the front gate of the campus again. The school looked the same from the outside. Polished brick, immaculate walkways, metal signs engraved with inspirational quotes. The air still carried that unmistakable mix of eucalyptus and bleach. The main building had new security posts, but the guards barely glanced at my badge. No one looked me in the eyes. It felt choreographed, just like it always had. The conference was small, maybe 30 people, all spread across a few rooms in the East Wing. There were sessions on narrative healing practices, embodied testimony in trauma recovery, and the ever-present empowerment through language. Every room had brochures. Every speaker referenced resilience like it was a product they were trying to sell. But I wasn't there for the panels. I slipped away after lunch when most people were networking in the courtyard. I walked the halls slowly, letting muscle memory pull me deeper into the school. Some wings had been renovated. Others were sealed off with plastic sheets and under construction signs. But one path just past the old science labs. Just a long corridor with windows that had been painted black. I followed it. At the end of the hallway was a fire door. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Hedges rusted, the handles stiff. I pushed harder than I expected and stumbled into what felt like another world. A vast, open-air pavilion stretched out in front of me, surrounded by whitewashed walls and overgrown vines. It was quiet, dead quiet. Even the birds didn't sing. The structure was low and wide, shaped like a flattened dome. No sign above the entrance, just a faded metal plaque half peeled from age. I walked around the side and found the edge of what looked like a map painted directly onto the outer wall. It listed various campus buildings, color-coded, the dorms, the art hall, the garden spaces. But where this building should have been, there was nothing. No label, no mark, just a patch of white paint that didn't quite match the rest of the wall. I had found it. Studio F. Inside, the air was stale, warm but unmoving. The floor was polished concrete, scuffed with streaks like something had been dragged across it many times. Rows of hanging lights ran the length of the ceiling, but none of them were on. Instead, spotlights mounted to wheeled bases were scattered across the space, pointing at nothing. There were no chairs, no desks, just metal stretchers, pushed into the corners like they'd been stored and forgotten. Some still had thin sheets draped over them, others were bare, the mattress covers cracked and flaking. Along one side of the room stood a long row of mirrors. They were all mounted on wheels, too, moved easily, angled deliberately. I stepped in front of one. And froze. My reflection looked back at me. But something was wrong. My mouth was smiling. I wasn't smiling. My arms were folded across my stomach, but in the mirror they were open wide. My eyes looked glassy, not distant, empty, like someone had wiped the inside clean and left only the shell. I turned to the next mirror. In this one, I looked younger, much younger, but my hands were red, slick and dripping. The blood didn't fall, it just shimmered, as if it had been painted onto the glass and not the figure. The third mirror showed a child, not me, a girl in a school uniform, holding a stethoscope to her own chest with her eyes closed. Her smile was stretched too wide. I staggered back. The mirrors weren't just warped, they were wrong. They didn't reflect reality. They reflected what the school wanted to see, or what it had buried. At the center of the room, beneath a single spotlight, was a square of stone embedded in the floor. A plaque, blackened with soot or age. Knelt to read it. Symptom removed, role preserved, empowerment eternal. My stomach twisted. I knew that phrasing. I'd heard echoes of it in counseling sessions, on pamphlets, from Riva's mouth when she explained why certain girls were no longer attending morning affirmations. They didn't treat symptoms, they reassigned them. I walked to the far end of the room where a small desk sat, steel utilitarian scratched to hell. One drawer was locked, rust flaking from the handle. I searched the surrounding shelves and finally found a key tucked behind a loose ceiling tile. Inside the drawer were gloves. Not latex, not surgical. Cloth. Pale gray, trimmed with white piping. They looked ceremonial, like something worn at a graduation or an award ceremony. Carefully folded, preserved. There was a label sewn inside each glove. Visitor, Dr. K. I froze. I had never used that title, never earned it. I hadn't finished medical school, I was just an intern, but someone had recorded me that way. Dr. K. The school had created a version of me that they could assign responsibility to, a figure who could be remembered for the ritual, but who no longer existed in any official capacity. And if I was the visitor, then that meant I had been invited into something I didn't understand. I turned toward the curtain at the back of the room. It was thick, velvet maybe, though worn. It hung from a rod bolted to the ceiling, the fabric brushing the floor in long folds. I reached for it, heart pounding, unsure of what I even expected to find. But before I touched it, I heard the voice. Close. Whispered like it was coming from inside my own chest. You were the first to confirm. That made you the infection. I jerked away from the curtain, but no one was there. The stretchers were still, the mirrors shimmered, the gloves trembled in my hands. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. Because in that moment, I finally understood. And then she finally I hadn't just watched the ritual. I had started it. Chapter 5, Mother of the Marked Ones. I didn't leave my flat for 3 days after Studio F. I tried. I'd get as far as the threshold, keys in hand, bag on my shoulder, only to stop cold and feel the weight again. That kind of weight doesn't come from fatigue or illness. It's the weight of being seen. Not just now, but before, years before. A long stare folded into time and tucked behind a mirror. The whisper in the curtain still rattled in my ears. You were the first to confirm that made you the infection. I didn't understand it, not completely, but it stayed with me. In the walls, in the mirror, in the sudden way I'd flinch whenever I heard children laughing on the street, because the girls at Olag used to laugh that way too. Light, easy, real. Until they didn't. Until they were given roles instead. On the 4th day, I took a bus to a township about 2 hours outside of Johannesburg. I didn't plan it. I didn't even remember buying the ticket. I just woke up, grabbed the red notebook again, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. A page stuck to the back cover. It had been glued down with some dried paste that cracked when I pried it loose. There was no writing on the paper, just a map, hand-drawn, simple landmarks, a post office, a church, a grocery stand, and at the center, a square labeled The Circle. That's where I went. The place wasn't on any official register. It looked like a converted farmhouse, its walls patched with uneven brick and its roof sagging in the middle. The yard was fenced with mismatched wire and iron rods, like it had been rebuilt by hand a dozen times. Inside there were maybe 10 women, quiet, aged far beyond their years, their eyes slow to lift. None of them spoke when I entered, but none of them stopped me either. They were sitting in a circle on woven mats. The room was bare except for a low table with a single candle flickering at the center. No pictures on the wall, no furniture, just space and stillness. And the singing, if you could call it that, it wasn't words, just soft, layered humming, harmonic, repetitive, like a lullaby stripped of language. It drifted like fog, wrapping around me without ever touching me directly. Their lips moved with care, but nothing shaped into syllables. It was like they'd forgotten how to speak, or had been taught to forget. I noticed the markings when one woman reached for a clay cup in the center. Her sleeve slipped, and I saw it. Branded into the skin of her forearm, a spiral, surrounded by sharp, angular triangles. Burned, not tattooed. Scarred. Another woman had the same shape, but mirrored. Another had just a triangle with a slash through it. I'd seen those symbols before. Once on a poster outside the old Olag Wellness building years ago. The poster had said, "Shape the story, frame the strength." At the time, I thought it was just an abstract design for a student art project. Now I understood. They weren't decorations. They were identifiers. Badges. A door creaked open behind me. I turned to see an older woman enter. Hair wrapped in blue cloth, skin like dark leather left in the sun too long. She didn't wear any symbols on her arm. She didn't sit with the others. She stood tall. "You're late," she said. Her voice was soft, but it split the room like thunder. I didn't speak. I didn't know how to explain myself. She crossed the room in slow, steady steps and looked down at the red notebook in my hands. "You carried the first list," she murmured. "Then you left it to rot. I swallowed, tried to ask who she was, but my mouth dried up. She answered anyway. I kept the ones who weren't rewritten. Her name was Mama Zaza. She said it without pride, as if the name no longer belonged to her. She wasn't on staff at OLAG, never had been, but she'd worked with girls from HIV-affected families for over 20 years, before the school, during it, and after. Daily wanted high empowerment index scores, she said. The ones who'd suffered but wouldn't make too much noise about it. Girls who knew how to smile without asking for more. She told me about the selection process, how family medical records were pulled from clinics with loose ethical oversight, how interviews were staged to make it seem like every student had overcome some shadow of trauma. But what really mattered was seropositivity. HIV risk. That's what the Empowerment Index measured, covertly. The higher the score, the more transformational the narrative could be. Donors didn't want charity, they wanted redemption arcs. But the school couldn't show sickness, not openly. It had to be abstracted. So they gave them roles, Zaza said. Not pills, not doctors, roles. The symbolic pathway, the bleeder, the mirror, the reclaimer. If you name the infection, they lose the story, so they changed the name. Called it power, called it process. I asked if any of the girls had received real treatment. She just looked at me. Treatment was considered reductive. That was the word used in the internal memos. Reductive. As if naming the virus, treating it medically, acknowledging its path through the body, was too small, too linear, too boring. Better to turn it into performance. I looked back at the circle of women, still humming, still lost in the soundless ritual. I asked how long they'd been here. Zaza shrugged. Some never left. Others came back when the roles broke them down. You think the robes were the worst of it. The hardest thing was remembering who they were before the color. She took a weathered folder from a shelf behind her. Inside were pages printed on thick, expensive paper, curriculum outlines, workshop protocols, a redacted document labeled Symbolic Reintegration, Empowerment versus Disclosure. My name was on page 3. Not my full name, just DRK. Again, credited with Emotional Compliance Design. I didn't even know what that meant. I used your silence, she said, not cruelly, but without mercy. You confirmed by not unconfirming. I asked if any of the girls still spoke about OLAG, about the rituals, about what they remembered. She shook her head. They don't remember in language. They remember in shape, in sound, in silence. Then one of the women stood. A girl, really, maybe 23, thin, bare feet, gold robe frayed and pinned at the side with a rusted brooch. She held a small, leather-bound booklet. She walked over to me and opened it. Inside were handwritten lines, broken into short verses. She pointed to one and read aloud. Her voice was dry but clear. We cannot cure what empowers us, but we can unname it. You did. I stepped back. Something in me wanted to run, not out of fear, but because the weight of knowing was growing too fast, too wide. Zaza watched me without blinking. You didn't infect them, she said. You helped erase the ones who were. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, the women began to hum again. Then in the middle of the circle, a robe lay empty, waiting. Chapter 6. The role you played was erasure. Back in Cape Town, I couldn't rest. Even in my own flat, even with the windows locked and the heat turned up to shake the cold of that township chapel off my skin, I could still feel it, that silence that hummed like a held breath. The robe, the symbols, the words that girl had read aloud, they didn't just settle in my memory. They infected it. They rewrote everything I thought I remembered about who I was back then, who I was supposed to be. I kept telling myself I wasn't responsible. I hadn't created the roles. I hadn't chosen which girls were bleeders, mirrors, or reclaimers. I hadn't drawn blood. I hadn't burned symbols into anyone's arm. But that story, the one that makes you feel clean just because your hands didn't hold the match, starts to fall apart when you realize you handed someone the box of matches and then turned away before the flame caught. I needed proof, something objective, something that would either clear me or confirm what I was starting to fear. That somewhere along the line I became a character in a play I never auditioned for. I started at the university library. I told the archivist I was researching wellness programs in educational settings. She pointed me to a digital repository of public NGO grant documentation. I didn't expect to find much. Most of OLOG's funding details were sealed, scrubbed, or funneled through third-party charity wings. But I searched anyway. Then I found it, buried in a PDF from 2011, a quarterly progress report titled Symbolic Pathway Grant, Phase 2 Pilot Assessment. It was blandly written. Corporate, careful. But there, on page 5, under Key Personnel, was a name I hadn't used in over a decade. DRK, Symbolic Physician, Emotional Compliance Division. I froze. They had given me a title. Not just a name, but a job description. It didn't matter that I'd never completed medical school, never held a license. In their system, I had been assigned authority. Manufactured authority. A fictional doctor to stand beside the real patients and keep their records fictional too. Further down, it said, developed and implemented compassionate erasure pathways for high-risk narrative candidates. Compassionate erasure. The words hit like a slap, the same way empowerment deviation did all those years ago. Soft on the surface, rotten underneath. I printed the report, read it 6 times. It never changed. The next morning, I went to the old city hospital. It was one of the government-funded buildings that sat on the edge of the city's budget, half renovated, always understaffed, stuck in the perpetual gray of fluorescent lighting and cracked linoleum floors. I knew the hospital well. I'd interned there briefly after I left OLAG. It hadn't changed. Same faded murals on the pediatric wing, same broken vending machines, same smell of disinfectant and stale bandages. I didn't use my name at the front desk. I didn't need to. I knew the halls. I knew the staff turnover rates. And I knew that the people who remembered OLAG's partnership wouldn't be the ones giving TED Talks. They'd be tucked into admin offices, pushing paper, still clinging to those old NGO badges and training lanyards like they meant something. I wandered until I found them. Behind a locked door on the 3rd floor, past a hallway labeled Records Transition, there was a small room, 4 desks, 2 staff members, and a wall covered in framed certificates for things like narrative sensitivity training and transformational ethics integration. And then I saw it. On the breast pocket of one of the women's jackets, a small enamel pin. Reframer, not diagnostician. I don't know what came over me, but I walked straight in. Didn't knock, didn't lie. I just held up the printout of the OLAG grant report and said, I need to know who wrote this. The younger of the 2 nurses blinked at me. The older one, the one with the pin, didn't move. I pointed to the section with my name. I didn't write this, but I think you know who did. There was a long pause. Then the older nurse stood. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week, or maybe a decade. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear, from memory. We were told it was narrative containment, she said finally. That, by reframing what we couldn't treat, we could still help them belong somewhere. I asked her what that meant. She shook her head. We weren't allowed to call them patients, just participants, and the ones with markers, they got pathways. That's what we were told. Pathways. Her voice cracked on that last word. She sat down slowly, as if her knees couldn't hold her anymore. "They needed you," she said. "You confirmed what we wouldn't. You gave it shape, and then you let it go unnamed. That's the power, not silence. Shape-shifting." I didn't speak. I couldn't. She opened a drawer behind her desk and pulled out a dusty file box. Inside were dozens of blank forms, templates, old intake sheets, ritual roll logs. She thumbed through them like she knew what she was looking for. Then she stopped, pulled out one sheet, handed it to me without a word. It was dated, stamped, signed at the bottom with my old intern ID number. The form was a symbolic pathway intake assessment. At the top, the standard language: narrative empowerment status, pending confirmation. And then, in a box marked outcome, it read, status, confirmed HIV+. Patient name, Zinle. I stood there, staring at it, the paper trembling in my grip. I didn't remember filling it out. I didn't remember signing it. But the handwriting was mine. The box was checked. The stamp was clean. I had confirmed her. And then I'd let her walk through that second door. Chapter 7. The Ceremony of Reclaiming. The envelope came folded into my newspaper. I hadn't subscribed to a paper in years. It was wedged in the middle, not mailed, just tucked, like a pressed flower or something meant to be hidden in plain sight. There was no name on the front, just a single symbol. A spiral, inked in black, the same shape I'd seen burned into the arms of those women in the township, the same one that showed up in the posters back at Olag, and once, long ago, in the corner of Zinle's file. Inside the envelope, a note, short, centered. You are invited to the ceremony of reclaiming. Return to where the mirrors never worked. Midnight, lower hall, come alone. There was no address, but I knew exactly where they meant. The original Olag grounds had layers. Beneath the bright white facades and the affirming slogans were foundations no one was meant to talk about. Hallways that didn't lead anywhere. Doors that didn't appear on blueprints. When I was an intern, I'd heard rumors of a storage area beneath the main assembly building, once used for old equipment. A staffer called it the lower hall, half joking, like a myth. I remembered how Xenia looked after her last session. I remembered where the mirrors didn't work. I went. The school was quiet when I arrived. Midnight meant no lights, no motion, just the distant hum of security equipment and the wind whispering through hedges. I slipped past the side gate, the one I knew wouldn't trigger alarms if opened slowly. I followed the west path, then the slope behind the old wellness center. There was a rusted service door there, nearly swallowed by ivy. It opened with one push. The air inside was thick, not musty, clean, somehow, but weighted, like the smell of something preserved for far too long. The floor beneath my shoes was tile, cracked in places, but swept. There were candles lining the hall, dozens of them. And beyond the corridor, in a wide, circular chamber I didn't know existed, stood a group of girls. No, women, wearing ceremonial robes in red, gold, and white. The robes looked faded, worn down from years of being passed between hands and shoulders. Some trailed thread. Others had been stitched in places where the seams had given up. The women stood in rows, silent, waiting. When I stepped inside, they began to speak in unison, soft, measured, like they were reading from memory. We are not symptoms. We are broadcasts of empowerment. We do not bleed. We transform. Their voices weren't angry. They weren't joyous either. They sounded solemn, hollow. At the front of the room, against a curved wall, were rows of plaques. Not names, not pictures, just quotes. Each one attributed to Oprah. Some I remembered from motivational posters. Others seemed altered. One read, "You are not what hurt you. You are what we told you to become." Under each quote was a strip of fabric, pieces of robes, pinned delicately with silver tacks, red, white, gold, faded into pink, ivory, rust, a patchwork of disappearance. Instead of graves, this was what they were given. Instead of flowers, they pinned their past selves to a wall of rewritten words. I stood there, overwhelmed. I didn't know why I was there, what they wanted. I thought maybe it was punishment, maybe it was a trial. Then one of the women stepped forward. She was older, her face familiar in a way that made my knees weaken. Zinle, it couldn't be. But her eyes, steady, dry, dark as oil, never blinked. And steadily, Nicole got out of bed, dark as oil. She held something in her hands, a robe, red. It was mine. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. The folds, the stitching, the spot where the collar had once torn. I'd never worn it, but it had always waited for me. She handed it to me without ceremony. "You may carry the erasure once more," she said. "You are the confirming hand." The others repeated the phrase, soft and exact. The confirming hand. It was not a title. It was a role. I put the robe on. It fit perfectly. They circled me. Not in a threatening way, but in ritual. Each woman touched the hem, the sleeve, the back. Like I was an artifact returning to the shelf. Or a mistake, finally labeled correctly. They began to chant the names of girls who had left their diagnoses behind. Not girls who had healed. Not girls who had died. Just left, as if the diagnosis was a coat shrugged off, passed down, like the robe. Each name was followed by silence, no story, no testimonial, just the name and a pause. Zingler's name came last. The longest pause followed. Then they turned away from me, returning to their places. I stood there, numb, the robe's fabric heavy across my shoulders. My hands felt colder than before. My fingers trembled, but I didn't drop the sleeves. On the far wall beside the plaques stood a withered tree. Its branches were bare, dry, skeletal. Pinned to it were more robe fragments. "The tree of transformation," someone whispered. I don't know who. I don't know if it was even said aloud. And then the ceremony was over. No applause, no curtain call. Just dispersal, quiet footsteps. The candles began to go out, one by one, as if snuffed by a breeze that only touched fire. I walked the corridor alone. The end of the hallway there was a glass panel, one of those mirrored security windows that show your reflection warped and stretched. I caught a glimpse of myself as I passed. The robe hung properly now. My face was calm, but my hands were bleeding. Bright red, a steady drip. But I felt no pain, just the warmth. I turned, sensing something behind me. There was no one there, but a voice reached me. Soft. Familiar? Maybe Riva's. Maybe Zinla's. Maybe even my own. There was never a cure. There was only a story you could survive inside. And just like that, the light in the corridor went out. Chapter 8. Doctor confirms. I don't know what day it is anymore. Time comes and goes like flickering hallway lights. I sit in the same chair for hours, not realizing I haven't moved. I try to eat, but forget the steps. The fridge is full of food I don't recognize buying. Mold grows without resistance. I open my mouth to speak sometimes and find I've said nothing. That my throat is just a hallway too, echoing old sounds that don't belong to me anymore. Sleep left weeks ago. Not like a thief, like a friend who packed their bags slowly, with eyes that said goodbye long before the door shut. Now the nights just stretch on, long and cold, whispering versions of my own name that don't fit right in my ears. The robe hangs in the corner. I told myself I wouldn't keep it, that I'd burn it, that I'd throw it into the sea. But when I tried, it didn't feel like cloth anymore. It felt like memory. It felt like a room inside me. Every day the mail slot clicks. Every day more envelopes arrive. Some are blank, some contain what look like test results, but the name fields are empty, the numbers smudged, the dates impossible. One said 1982, one said 2047. Some are birthday cards. They're always unsigned, or signed with names I almost recognize. Girls I met once, girls I watched walk into the second door, girls I may have confirmed, girls I may have erased. One envelope held only a photograph. My face, smiling, surrounded by students in red robes. But I was never in that photo, not when it was taken. I kept them all. They're stacked in piles around the flat now, little altars of things unspoken, each one heavier than the last. This morning, or maybe it was yesterday, I found the final envelope. It didn't come through the mail slot. It was waiting on the kitchen counter. I don't remember putting it there. The flap was already open. Inside was a name tag. Plastic, laminated, brand new. White text on black. Dr. K, Reclaimer Unit. There was no blood, no spiral, no threats. Is the new job. I held it in my hand for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even shake. Because by then, I understood. I wasn't being haunted. I was being recalled. The program had never ended. The roles never dissolved. We didn't close the doors. We just renamed the rooms. There's a new building now. The brochures call it a wellness hub. The donors call it a trauma integration center. The press calls it a soft revolution in adolescent mental health. I call it a sequel. It has clean floors, open air, natural lighting. The girls wear robes in pastel now. The gold thread is subtler. The chants are shorter. They laugh sometimes, but none of them speak. None of them blink. And I stand in front of them, wearing the robe they gave back to me, the name tag on my chest, the clipboard in my hand. They call me Doctor now. Dr. K. No one asks for the initials, and I don't offer them. Behind me, a one-way mirror watches. I don't check the reflection anymore. I know what I'll see. My face is calm. My robe is clean. My hands don't bleed. Not today. Maybe tomorrow. And when the group is dismissed and the girls file out in silence, I stay in the room a little longer. Just me and the quiet. And I whisper to the walls. Because the walls were always the last to forget. We caught nothing. We carried everything. And we let you believe it was clean.